Why do governments subsidize affordable housing for private landlords, instead of the government buying building and owning the building itself? We used to have exactly that in the UK, and then Thatcher came along and sold them all off. The socioeconomic trend and ideology the US and much of the West has embraced since the late 70s early 80s is neoliberalism. It involves a symbiotic relationship between the state and the market whereby there is a careful balance between laissez-faire free market and protectionist interventionist economic policies. The government exists to use public funds to stimulate and protect the market. This playlist on YouTube gives a good rundown. https://youtube.com playlist list equals platavatu's 3zkmbvln ahapper zeros hzis hjl4 fdsi equals s4 0 z yay pbhwkk's edit. Grammar. Public housing, as we know it in the US, started in the 1930s with FDR. Those projects, like Father Panic in Bridgeport, CT and Chad Brown in Providence, RI worked reasonably well when middle-class, working people families made up the bulk of the residents. Post-WW2 things went downhill pretty rapidly with suburbanization, deindustrialization and white flight. Once the bulk of the residents were non-working poor people, the projects turned into hellholes. Some projects, like the ones built in NYC where Robert Moses was in charge, were, at least arguably, deliberately designed as hellholes to begin with, but most weren't. There are ways to do small-scale, mixed-income public housing. We have some here in New Haven, but public housing as whole hasn't gone that well in the US. This country doesn't have a national housing policy, and the US Department of Housing is, well, it's honestly just smoke and mirrors in this specific context of conversation. That isn't me being judgmental for or against any of their policies or anything that they have or have not done. That is me saying that as a whole the entire US Department of Housing is not exactly what people believe it to be, nor does it function in the way that people believe that it does. If you want some interesting information, you can watch this video U2.berg Neo T4NQ4C equals NDKXN97PZD2WPHX. She is a bar-certified lawyer, not just some random person speaking on legal stuff. However, I value transparency, so I will tell you in advance that her talking points tend to be very liberal in nature. As such, keep in mind that this is only some of the overall perspective, and if you want more information on a subject point she makes more completely, I would encourage you to look further into any of the talking points that she does mention on your own and through other sources to get a more accurate representation of the overall picture. When the government built housing projects, they turned into disasters, like Cabrini Green. This used to be a thing. Many cities had government-owned housing. These are known as the projects. But as with every government-run social program, once Republicans gained a majority power in Congress, the funding was cut beyond sustainable levels. Cities and states could no longer afford to maintain these locations to quality standards. Plus, housing was only one part of a much bigger problem: lack of opportunity. A lot of the housing projects were not located near jobs, nor was there public transit that made getting to jobs reliably an easy task. So the program failed. The US and local governments built and managed affordable housing in the 50s and 60s. It turns out that governments do not make good or responsible landlords. The resulting high-rise slums, aka the projects, were truly frightening. You had to see it to believe it. By the 70s, it became obvious that subsidizing housing that was privately and competently owned and operated resulted in actual livable conditions for low-income residents. There will always be complaints about low-income housing, but you need to have seen something like Chicago's Cabrini Green or Robert Taylor projects to put it in perspective. I am assuming you are a US citizen, so I'll answer on behalf of why it's this way in the USA. Other countries may be different. The problem with the USA is just how huge the amount of land there is for one government body to manage it all. They simply cannot handle the daunting task of managing 50 states spread out over vast distances. So they outsource everything. Labor, ownership, construction, etc. all gets outsourced to local, private groups who can do the work. This also leads to corruption when a local private company doesn't have to do a good job, because there's no one to regulate them. Also, there's a huge push for deregulation in the USA, and so it's always a fight. Because any time the government has owned and run housing, it has been a disaster. The rents don't keep up with repair needs and they eventually fall to ruin. That many people packed together creates a microcosm of crime. They don't have the same ability to evict bad tenants, and things just get worse. The whole point is to get lower-income people decent housing. Federal housing projects have been tried in the past, and always fall into decline quickly. Instead of the government buying building and owning the building itself, Because in the US, when the government tries that, these housing projects become death traps and crime villages. It is easier and cheaper to provide standards and enforcement for private ownership than to maintain these buildings themselves. Government-owned housing has always been a colossal waste of money for what quickly turns into a run-down dump. Part NIMBYism, part taxpayer money funneled to real estate investors. For the US fascists who want to eliminate government and replace it with for-profit corporations have successfully convinced a large part of the country that only profit-seeking entities are capable of accomplishing anything. The reality is both governments and corporations hire subject matter experts. Moneyed assholes don't have expertise in construction or property managements, but only government has to deal with extremists who get elected, appointed, or hired with the intent to destroy from within. The real root of the reason is probably because government housing was not segregated, meaning black and white people had to live potentially in the same neighborhood. Conservatives completely lost their shit in the 60s over integration and the civil rights movement, and to this day it influences every position or policy they have. Government cannot discriminate, but there are unlimited ways a private entity can without outright saying it. Everyone mentioning that public housing turned into slums completely ignores the fact that tons of private housing turns out that way, or that it's inevitable without proper oversight, maintenance, etc. It's impossible to run any organization without budget. Proving tax credits or low-interest bonds keeps the risk directly from the government minimal, and they aren't on the hook for maintenance. They don't have to screen tenants, set up a housing program with staff and benefits. They don't have to pay for security. It's all handled by the developer or landlord, which they can hold accountable if the affordable portion of the development never happens, gets downsized, etc. We still do this in Canada. Each province or territory does it a bit different, but for the most part we build, own and rent out affordable housing. If someone else wants to build affordable units, we have programs to give them funding if they keep rent affordable for so many years. We do have programs that help with rent for people in the private market, but the income limits are a bit higher, so they are intended for people who don't qualify for the affordable housing we own because they make too much money, but still need help. In Portland, Home Forward near the Portland Housing Authority owns the most units in town. Problem is, Home Forward is not real great at running stuff, and some of the non-profits, especially the ones that provide services, are way better for tenants. Of course, there are some non-profits that live for 15 developers' fees and keep the friends and family of Guff well fed and well paid. Not a lot of private owners of affordable E60 AMI restrictions, since they are hard properties to manage and have a ton of compliance you have to do. So this is a product of the overarching economic and political ideology that is subscribed to by the Western world. People often call it capitalism, which certainly isn't incorrect. However, modern capitalism is better described as neoliberalism. This ideology assumes that free markets lead to the greatest amount of production, prosperity, and personal freedom. A classic example of neoliberal policy is governments providing subsidies or tax breaks for private corporations to fill a need. In this case, rather than building and maintaining housing, governments that subscribe to neoliberalism will instead provide tax breaks and subsidies to private corporations to build and maintain housing. It's an interesting topic with lots of interesting literature and research behind it. Personally, I feel that it's an outdated and demonstrably false ideology. The short answer is we tried that as public housing, and it was routinely funded at 70% of the required amount. After decades of underfunding, the housing projects were in severe disrepair. The US government realized the public housing model won't work with underfunding, so the focus shifted to programs that allow private entities to control and operate projects. Private financing aka big banks and tax credit investors are incentivized to fund these projects and are comfortable underwriting this model, which keeps the projects properly funded. Please note, many affordable housing developers are nonprofit serving a specific mission. Doctor, we tried that. We realized it will never be properly funded. Allowing private ownership and incentivizing private financing is more realistic. Because playing Monopoly in real life is way more fun,